Well, I think that the U.S.-Canadian Free Trade Zone is an important development, and I think what we have to do, every time a country enters the European community, which, I mean, they're our best friends, and we've encouraged European unity, and I'm all for it, let me say. But we also have to face the fact that every time a country enters the European community, we lose a customer, or at least we lose favorable terms of trade with a customer. We lose some of our best customers, as we did when Spain, for example, entered the European community, and that effect is going to be more dramatic by 1992, when they're a fully integrated economy. It's more profitable for member countries to trade with each other than it is for them to trade with us. And it's so that kind of advantage, by the way, cannot be offset by any amount of so-called American competitiveness. And I think some of the discussion of trade policy in this country needs to take a lot more account than it does of the development of these sort of preferential trading areas. The Soviet bloc really constitutes a major preferential trading zone in which it is much more profitable for countries inside. It's much, well, let's say there are a variety of ways in which countries inside the bloc are encouraged to trade within the bloc, and it's less advantageous for them to trade outside the bloc. There's subsidies of various kinds and barters arrangements and so forth. Now, I think that in order to promote American trade, we need also to get access to markets on equal terms. And maybe the way to do it in a world of preferential trading zones is to try to expand the free trade zones in which we can operate on an equal basis, which they operate on the basis of free trade without subsidization, and we do. And maybe what we should do is further expand that concept. We partly did that through the Caribbean Basin Initiative, by the way, to Central America and the Caribbean. I think we ought to take the other step with regard to the CBI, and maybe consider discussing it further in the hemisphere. In the hemisphere, a lot of other countries in the hemisphere have lost their best customers, but with the development of the European community. I have personally talked to President Alfonsín, for example, of Argentina, and about the impact of, and I've heard it from him, about the impact of the development of the European community on Argentina's markets for its agricultural products in Western Europe. The impact's been very great.
What do you think of the theories that the European community might turn into a third superpower?
Well, it ought to be one. It ought to be one right now. It is, after all, more populous than the Soviet Union, and certainly is highly developed technologically and industrially, sophisticated populace, and it is, still something of a fiction, although the policies, like those common economic policies, the common market, are making it more and more of a unit. It is a fact that the French still feel more French and the Germans more German and so forth. And that is, I think, it is that lack of unity which is the principal obstacle to the further development of Europe into a superpower, but certainly it has all the capacities for fully effective major competition with anybody.
Kind of moving away from some of the specifics, concerning like the voting in the UN, as it stands now, each country, is entitled to one vote. Would you be in favor maybe of a more weighted type system? No, not not security.
Right. I don't think so, but I do think that on budget, some very the budgeting, there are lots of problems have developed about development of the budget expenditures inside the UN. And it doesn't just involve the U.S., but it involves other countries as well. As a matter of fact, it might interest you to know that the U.S. and the Soviet Union have always cooperated very closely on questions of budget and administration inside the UN, because we are the principal donors and they're the second largest donors. And so they too have an interest in keeping UN salaries at reasonable levels and avoiding, wild and unreasonable expenditures and so forth. Although their contribution is only about half of ours. The fact is that the 85 countries in the United Nations pay 1/10%. Or pay less, let's just say 85, most of them pay 1/10%. 86 countries in the United Nations pay less than 10% of the total. And most of those pay 1/10%, which is to say trivial. 14 countries pay 85% of the UN budget. And of those, 10 pay well over half. Of the 10 top donors to the UN who pay over half the budget, almost all of them have been voting against the budget for years now, or else abstaining. Only one of the top 10 major donors has voted for the UN budget in the last, probably now 9 years. What happens is that the countries that have the votes don't pay the bills. So they can raise expenditures at will and never suffer any penalty for it. And the countries who pay the bills don't have the votes on expenditures. And so, they're just stuck with it. And some very extremely sort of extravagant practices have developed. I always remember an ad that there used to be in the New Yorker magazine. It was there in the New Yorker for a couple of years while I was at the UN, and it showed, this is an accurate description, it showed an intercontinental hotel, picture of an intercontinental hotel, and a Concorde plane. And the legend was, when you Concorde to your next international conference, when you Concorde to the next UN conference, be sure to book at the Intercontinental Hotel. Now, Intercontinental hotels are very expensive, and what that ad reflected was, the extravagance of UN conferences. The UN, by the way, itself picks up much of the bill on the UN conferences, including the travel bill for the participants. None of the donor countries give their representatives the kind of money that would enable them to take the Concorde or stay at intercontinental hotels, as a matter of fact. But the UN can afford it. That's, 1983. 84, I guess, maybe. It was 84. The very depth of the Ethiopian famine. There was added on in the budget, the vote from the floor of the General Assembly, a $73 million appropriation to build a $73 million conference center in Addis Ababa. Now, if there's anything that the people of Ethiopia needed less at that stage than a $73 million conference center, it's hard to imagine what that would be. And all of the major donors voted against it, as all the major donors vote against really quite extravagant pension proposals and fringe benefits for UN employees. But they pass because the majority is there to pass them. So I think that there needs to be some kind of principles of fiscal responsibility introduced into UN budgeting. I think it's really absolutely essential. But I think probably the way that it could be done is not through weighted voting, but through the principle of consensus in which a number of UN bodies operate. If you had, and this is what, by the way, the UN appointed a group of 18 so-called experts, it's called the Group of 18, to study the possibilities of fiscal reform, because so many countries are complaining so bitterly. In the U.S., Congress had voted to withhold 25% of our contributions. And the G18, so-called, recommended that a budgeting committee be established, which did the overall budget for the organization, that there always be included on that committee 3 or 4 of the major donors to the UN, and that all decisions be made by consensus, and that the budget recommended by that group of experts couldn't be added to from the floor except by consensus on the floor. Something like that, I think, would be a reasonable kind of a move to introduce more fiscal responsibility.
As it stands now, with the U.S. being the largest donor and as well as the largest lender to these third world countries and stuff, does that have any influence at all on our vote?
No. No, doesn't really. No, we make our votes are decided on different principles than that. Most of the things we vote against, we would vote against whether we were the largest contributor or not, as a matter of fact.
In South Korea this summer, we had the opportunity to talk to several students who were involved in protests, and some of them had some pretty anti-American government sentiments because they thought the U.S. government supported the existing military government. And for some of us, that was kind of confusing for a country who supports democracy all over the world to support the people who are trying to keep a more democratic form of government out of a country. Do you think that's
I don't think, no, I don't think it is at all. I think that the United States is probably the principal force, in fact, encouraging democratization in South Korea, and that the last elections have a great deal to do with U.S. encouragement of South Korean democracy. That's now, you were there before that happened, and a lot of the dissidents in South Korea, opponents of the government, didn't believe those elections would ever take place. It would be interesting if you went back and talked to some of the same people. The U.S. government intervened repeatedly, in fact, to what the diplomats called démarches, to, let's just say, remind the South Korean government of how much importance we attach to free and fair elections in South Korea. And I think most of the observers, international observers to those elections, believe those were free and fair elections, of course, in which the 2 opposition candidates between them won more than 50%. But, I mean, you can't blame the U.S. for the fact that they weren't united. You can blame us for a lot of things, but you can't blame us for that. They're the ones who decided not to unite. Actually, they had an agreement to unite, you may recall, and they broke that agreement themselves and blew their majority. No.
On the subject of intervention.
Pardon me?
On the subject of intervention, United States intervention. I was just wondering how you can, I believe that you support non-intervention in South Africa, the problems that they're having there.
Well, I mean, it depends on what kind.
Well, I was just wondering how you justify supporting non-intervention in some countries and then the contrary.
I don't, you've never found anything, frankly, that I've ever written or said that I supported non-intervention in South Africa. I support what I consider effective intervention. And I believe very much, in fact, that the United States should, with regard to South Africa, take steps that are likely to be effective in encouraging South Africans to provide full and equal rights to all their citizens. And I believe that very much. And I have always believed it. Now, it may be that you have concluded that because I don't really oppose sanctions, against the economic sanctions that exist against South Africa, but I don't think they're effective. I mean, I don't think it makes much difference, but I don't think we should imagine that it's going to have much impact on the situation in South Africa. I learned a lot of things about the world while I was at the UN. And one of the things I learned about the UN was, for example, about South Africa and about trade with South Africa and the extent to which U.S. trade with South Africa is a lot less important than the trade of a lot of other countries. There's a lot of something close to propaganda about this in the world, and it's worth informing yourself about if you're interested in this area. We are not the largest traders with South Africa by any means, and we never have been. We're not the largest investors in South Africa. The Western Europeans are. We go back to the European community. Just as they were the principal settlers in South Africa, they've also been the principal investors. And they go right on trading with South Africa. The cynicism which afflicts a lot of foreign policy is nowhere clearer than with South Africa. That's first of all, of course, South Africa's black neighbors are major traders with South Africa. South Africa is their major trading partner. But second, the European community is major trading partner with South Africa. Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and Romania, and Czechoslovakia, Hungary are major trading partners with South Africa. Scandinavian countries, this always interests me a lot, to watch the Scandinavian who tend to be extremely moralistic in their pronouncements about international affairs, watch their trade figures with South Africa. There was one year in which the most rapid increase in trade with South Africa, this one year in the 80s that I happened to check the figures, it was about 1984, I think. The two countries with the most rapidly increasing trade with South Africa were Sweden and Czechoslovakia. Now, that being the case, we just sort of kid ourselves. I mean, it being the case that there is such widespread global trade with South Africa. Japan has increased its trade with South Africa quite substantially. We kid ourselves if we imagine that our economic sanctions are going to make a large difference. I don't think they make much difference at all, quite frankly. I think we can do them if we feel. I think we ought to make very clear to South Africa what we think about their policies, and we ought to make very clear that we believe that racial discrimination is and denial of equal rights to South Africans of all races is morally obnoxious and incompatible with civil peace in South Africa, and and we ought to make clear that we wish they would behave differently. If we don't want to deal with them economically, if it makes us feel better to not deal with them economically, then that's all right with me too. But I don't think we should imagine that we're going to be able to transform South Africa by our policies. That's because we're not. That's just the nature of the world today. I think Americans have a tendency to overestimate our importance in the world, put it bluntly. We have a tendency to overestimate the impact of what we do on the world or what we don't do on the world. The fact is that the world today, is got a number of rich, powerful nations and groups, and most of them go their own way, and they're not that influenced by our preferences or our principles or our policies. So this too we just have to face, I think. That's what I have a preference for policy in South Africa. My own view about South Africa's evolution is that there are in South Africa some whites and blacks and coloreds who genuinely support real multiracial democracy for South Africa. And I think they worked together on the Natal Plan, the new Natal Constitution, for example, which the government of South Africa turned down. But I think these are the people and the kinds of people that we ought to support in South Africa, and that we ought to look for ways to support such people and their institutions, their trade unions and businesses and so forth.